I'm going to give you some context for this next piece because it really informed how the work was shaped and thought about. Waarheidstisch was produced at Schloss Mittersill, which Schloss means castle, in Austria. And it was located between Innsbruck and Salzburg. And it's this wonderful structure that was built initially in 1150 AD. The townspeople in the town below felt oppressed by the aristocracy and came up the hill and burned it down. And then the aristocracy retaliated and made the townspeople rebuild it. And so there was animosity between the rich and the poor in this site. And then as time moved on, there were other things that happened on this site. One of the events was during the Middle Ages and right at the cusp of the Reformation movement. Some Dutch Christians were coming through the area. They stopped at Schloss Mittersill, and there was a different brand of religion being practiced on the castle grounds. And there were discussions between the two parties, and the bottom line is that there were Christians burned at the stake on this site. In addition to that, there were people identified in the surrounding regions. And by the way, one of the roles of this castle was to house the noble, but also the judges for the valley. So any political issues, territorial issues, court-type issues were settled on this site. And one of the issues of the day was witchcraft. And so there were individuals that were identified as witches, and they were brought to this site and put in a real dungeon, which just so happened to be right below the chapel and the altar. And on this site, there were human beings put in cages and left to rot through starvation. Fast forward, there were happier times, and of course, a lot of positive things happened here. People married and had children, and people lived on the grounds and so forth. But this particular area was known for its deer hunting, and so a lot of deer hunting happened on this site. And one of the features of this castle is that there was one entrance into the space, and then it was surrounded by buildings. And it was very protected because it was perched on the edge of this hill. The hill happened to be about 1,500 feet above the town of Mittersill, or the village of Mittersill. And to this day, it is being used as these days, a conference center. Well, during this deer hunting phase, which lasted into the early 20th century, it changed hands a number of times, but it became a popular place for people to hunt, but also to do trap shooting. And so into the early part of the 20th century, it became a hot spot for the European wealthy. And eventually, it became popular for, because this is in the Alps, for people that could afford to come and hang out for a period of time. They had a restaurant and a bar and so forth. And so it attracted American movie stars to come and trap shoot. So Bing Crosby and Bob Hope shot clay pigeons on this site. A few short years after that, however, what happened was that the Nazis came into Austria, and they came to this site, and the Gestapo set up headquarters for the valley on this site. In addition to that, they imported 14 Polish women to do all of the domestic tasks necessary to run the castle. The cooking, the cleaning, etc., and presumably they became sex slaves on this site. Interestingly enough, after the war, they were never heard of again, these 14 women. They were not accounted for. All documents were destroyed that would connect them to these 14 women. Medical experiments were carried on by the Nazis on this site. Like a prophet outside the gate, Wahrheitstisch, which means truth table, acts as a reminder to what went on here. Another interesting thing is that around 2000 there was a major windstorm and it blew over trees on the site, and like good Austrians who use wood for everything, they milled the trees to make lumbers for future use, and they built a shed to go over the lumber. So when I arrived, I was able to use the lumber from the site to build the piece. So this is the piece, and it's located on a knoll outside the main gate to get into the castle. It's a beautiful spot because you can see the valley down below through the trees. This pathway leads to an obstacle, and the obstacle then you have choice at that obstacle to either turn around and go back, and the pathway was level, the ground was sloping. And your other choice is to go down this stairway adjacent to a round wall, which you, if you were here this morning, learned that can act as a symbol, a walking symbol for repentance, and that's how this was used. And walking down this ramp, or excuse me, this stairway, led you to the unknown because you didn't know what was behind the obstacle. And coming down this space then, you turn around and you see where you've come from, but you also see what is in front of you. There are two benches and a long table and a round wall at the end. The round wall is a reference to the fact that this was a trap shooting club and a shooting club in its past. Well, the other thing is that the pathway that got you to this point was also passing through the obstacle, and it became a table. So the pathway that you walked on became a table for community, and the benches around it then were allowing you to sit down and partake in conversation or whatever. The other thing about the benches is that there were 7 supports on each side, totaling 14 supports. You do the math. The backside then shows this one component that connects the obstacle to the target, if you will, and that just incidentally happened to point straight back to the Austrian flag perched on the very pinnacle of the roof of the castle. And as we were working on the piece and finishing it up, we learned from it, as often happens, about the piece. Now, this is a sensitive, delicate piece, and we had the semblance of an opening. And by the way, this was in the context of a European arts conference. And one of the things that you should also know about this site these days is that in 1967, they had great difficulty finding owners for the castle because nobody wanted to touch it because of its history. And in 1967, a parachurch organization purchased it to become a training center for Christians who were oppressed behind the Iron Curtain at the time. And so for years, for decades, it was a training center for people that could get out for a month or less on a visa They would get heavy theological training to be able to go back into their own countries and be active in the underground church on this site. Well, I conclude with this, and that is a quote from Desmond Tutu. What I see as a meta-narrative or connection is that this is a particular site, a particular history, and it's ongoing. Every place has its own history, both negative and positive. And what we're left with is, what are we going to do from here?